Aha! Let's look at pirate swords. What swords did pirates actually use? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So obviously I'm holding a toy pirate sword here, but there's a reason for that. And that is because I think in the public mind's eye, pirates have a form of cutlass. So the pirate cutlass is an iconic object which is featured in many movies and art and all kinds of stuff, all kinds of media. But the fact is, it is based on a real thing. But what's it actually based on? And did pirates actually have any sort of cutlass that looked anything like this at all? But the first thing to say, of course, is that pirate is a very loose term and covers a huge amount of human history and all over the world. So clearly there were Japanese pirates, Chinese pirates, there were pirates in the Caribbean, European pirates, African pirates, Indian pirates, so on and so forth. So clearly the term pirate is very, very vague. But what I'm going to look at here is the classic idea of the pirate, as featured in with a bunch of famous pirates who we're actually going to look at some, in the period that basically covers the middle of the 17th century through to about the middle of the 18th century. And that being the case, the classical idea of a cutlass, and this is a real antique cutlass from the 19th century, doesn't really fit with that because this is a later type of sword with this characteristic bowl guard. So we're going to be looking at earlier types of sword. But before I go on, I want to have a word about our sponsors who make a lot of the videos on this channel, which you get to watch for free, possible. So thanks to them. And our sponsors for this video are Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is a massively popular turn-based fantasy combat game that you can play on your mobile or your PC, and it features swords much like this and a whole bunch of other types of fantasy medieval weaponry. One of the great things about Raid Shadow Legends is how deep the lore is for the different factions, and one of the first factions you'll meet are the Banner Lords. You can use my link below to download the game for yourself onto your mobile or PC. The Banner Lords are basically medieval knights in a massive kingdom in the west of Teleria. They're arrogant and warlike and believe themselves to be on the side of good, but the orcs, ogrins, skinwalkers and lizardmen would disagree. The lands of the Banner Lords were taken from the non-humans by force and kept through centuries of persecution with the help of the Sacred Order. Now though, with the Banner Lords weakened by constant wars, it might be the time for these races to get their own back. Here's one of my favourite of the Banner Lords, Vanguard, and you can see he's got a really awesome shield, a bit like a pavis, and a cool spear. And here's another one of my favourites, and that's Conqueror, and he's got awesome plate armour and a cool poleaxe. I love playing in the classic arena. I also really love training up my champions in the sparring pit. I also love going into the tavern to upskill some of my champions. So this month there's an insane amount of new content and things to do on Raid. There's going to be 11 new champions, but moreover 200 new missions to complete. And you'll get an exclusive legendary champion if you complete all of them. And if that wasn't enough, they've added 5 new tough levels to almost every dungeon in the game. That's absolutely immense for this month. So as ever, Raid continues to grow and grow. So there's never been a better time to get started. So what are you guys waiting for? Go to the link in my description box just below here, help support the channel and give Raid a go. It's free to play, free to download on your mobile or your PC. I play under the name Captain Context, and if you're quick enough you can join my clan. And it's that easy. Go and check out that link and I will see you in game. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the topic of this video, and that is pirate swords. So if they didn't use these types of 19th century cutlasses, what did they actually use? So I guess the first thing to say on this topic is that pirates were essentially like anybody else, and they could use any type of sword. Not to say that they didn't have preferences, and we're going to look at that with some specific examples of famous pirates and how they were represented in art. But first of all, let's just have a little look at the types of swords that were available to them in this period. Now, it just so happens that luckily for you guys, I'm an antique sword dealer, so I actually have original examples of many of these types of sword available to me. Before I go into the 17th and 18th century types of swords being used, I just want to have a word about the earlier period of piracy, really the beginning of the golden age of piracy in the 16th century. So going back to Sir Francis Drake's time, for example. And in that period, it does seem that because piracy had a slightly different nature and was royally endorsed, and in many cases was just simply an extension of war, it was a form of guerrilla warfare on the seas, you could say. Many of the commanders, at least, would have been wearing exactly the same sort of swords as any other kind of military commander. So we see the typical types of mortuary-hilted sword, basket-hilted backsword, broadsword, rapiers indeed being widespread, and also what we'd now call side swords, which are closely related to rapiers, should we say. So we see a similar broad set of swords being carried by people like Sir Francis Drake in the 16th century. But when we get into the 17th century, we start to see piracy as perhaps a more distinct and to some degree less royally endorsed or less state endorsed activity, and in many cases these pirates gained such power and such large fleets that in many cases no national fleet could actually compete with them in certain areas. So they were really very powerful, and you could almost say warlords, rulers in their own right. So really what we're going to look at here is the mid 17th century, so around 1650 through to the mid 18th century, so say around 1750, which is really after the golden age of piracy. Most of the famous pirates that you will have heard of date to the late 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s. So in this period we could break swords down into essentially three main kind of types. Okay, there are types of swords carried by common people's sidearms, weapons of self-defense. Then there's upper class swords of self-defense and dueling, so we could say gentlemanly swords. And then there's also what I'd class as military swords, so swords which you wouldn't necessarily carry around on a day-to-day basis, but which were used by cavalry or infantry officers, artillery officers, people like this. So let's begin with those. So a common type of common person's weapon at this time was something that we will call a hangar. Now it did go by other names in this period, and you'll notice in terms of the blade it's quite similar to what some of you will think of as a pirate sword, and we'll talk about more about that when we look at some specific examples. But generally these are cut-centric swords with a thrusting capacity, so you can cut and thrust with them, but they are clearly, or should we say, they have a preference towards the cut. They can be straight or curved, usually single-edged with a form of false edge usually at the back, and the point can take different forms. This is what's called a cat's claw or clipped back point, and that indeed is something that's featured even on the toy pirate sword I showed earlier, and we'll talk more about those as we go along. But they did have different types of points, and you could get hatchet points, spear points, different point designs on here, and they had various forms of hilt, and we'll talk more about that as well. In the hilt designs change with period. In the earlier period we have more shell hilts and basket hilts, and these weapons were sometimes known as dussac, they're sometimes known as cutto, so they go by different names in different places, different times. Dussac is a word that we find more in the sort of German kind of German and Dutch kind of areas, and then cutto is more of a word we find more in France, which becomes probably the word cutlass in England, but also in England we use the word hanger as well, probably because it hangs, you can wear it anywhere. It's a sidearm. Okay, that's what sidearm means. So that's the kind of, we could say, the civilian or kind of lower class everyday carry. Not to say that there weren't upper class versions of these as well. There were fancy versions, but so they were used by every part of society, but particularly favoured by people like sailors, it has to be said. And again, we'll come back to that. Now, the other end of the social spectrum, so in this period, the rapier had really given way to what we call the small sword. And this is a specialised thrusting sword, famously used for duelling, but in fact, it wasn't just used for duelling, it was used for everyday carrying, for self-defence, all sorts of things. And indeed, it was occasionally carried by pirates. So the specialised thrusting sword, and this could take, in its earlier forms, this would be what we call a transitional rapier. So the transitional rapier was a late form of rapier that comes into the small sword. Certainly by the year 1700, when a lot of the really famous pirates were around, this would have been a common gentleman's weapon. But we have reasons to believe they weren't particularly popular for pirates. We'll look at possible reasons why in a bit. And then finally there's military swords. Now military swords, specifically looking at cavalry swords, okay, in this period. So a small sword isn't very good for a cavalryman, and a short sword like the hanger is not very good for a cavalryman, so they tend to have bigger swords, and probably one of the most famous forms of that is the basket-hilted broadsword or backsword. It's a broadsword if it's double-edged, it's a backsword if it's single-edged. This is actually single-edged, this one. So an 18th century basket-hilted sword. Now, many of you will associate these with the Highlanders and the Jacobite rebellion, But in fact, they were used by lots of different people, particularly in the British Isles. The English had their own forms of basket hilt. This is probably an English one, actually. The Lowland Scots and the Highland Scots had different forms of swords. The Irish had their own forms. And there were other forms of basket hilt around this time as well on continental Europe. There were German forms of basket hilt, there were Venetian forms of basket hilt, the schiavona, and so on and so forth, and many different types of hilt designs. They didn't all look like this, but this gives you the general idea. So a fully enclosed basket with a long single or double-edged blade, clearly a sword that you can cut or thrust with. But we know that the styles of swordsmanship used with these put quite a lot of emphasis on the cut, it has to be said, although there are thrusts in there as well. And then there are other forms of cavalry sword, particularly on the continent where they didn't have these particular fully enclosed type of basket hilts. And this is a walloon hilted backsword in this case. They can again be double-edged or single-edged. And they can have pointier blades, longer blades, shorter blades, various variety. But there are various different types of hilt which were popular in continental Europe that would have definitely been used by pirates at this time. So as I hope you can see, there is a vast variety of types of sword that could have been used by pirates at this time. They could have used the gentlemanly swords of rapiers, transitional rapiers and small swords, and their related swords as well, which were spadroons. So here's another example, which is essentially like a small sword, but it has some cutting capacity. So perhaps you could argue somewhat slightly better in self-defense situations. Or indeed, they would have used hangers or military swords, whatever their personal preferences were. So, and in the earlier period probably would have seen more rapiers and maybe more things like basket hilted dussacs. And then as we get into the 18th century, we would have seen more simple hilted hangers and small swords as well. So to some degree, what swords pirates carried went with the fashions of the time, and they would have shifted with that. So even if they used a similar sword, say they used a form of dussac in the late 1600s, by the early 1700s they might be using a form of hanger that might have a different style hilt, but functionally it's still basically a short saber type blade with some type of clip point or spear point on the end of it. So functionally not very different, even if the style of the hilt, and this is a later Georgian one, even if the style of hilt had changed somewhat during that time. So having said that pirates could use any sword they like and any sword they could get access to, did they actually have any preferences? Well, there are some people who are very into pirates who would very much argue that, oh yeah, pirates preferred this type of sword for these reasons. And I can certainly see some logic to that, because of course, if we look at the naval cutlass is different to the infantry hanger in a number of ways for a variety of reasons. That can be to do with the fighting environment, the fact that you're fighting on a ship, that you're boarding ships, the fact that you might be fighting under the decks of ships, so you need perhaps shorter blades in some circumstances. The fact that you might not only use the sword as a weapon, that you might need it for chopping rope or chopping wood in certain circumstances, so it might need to be a more robust type of sword you can use for a variety of tasks. Or indeed, it could be because of the type of opponents you're facing. And we shouldn't forget that just as I mentioned, you found pirates all over the world. In some cases, English or French or Spanish pirates would have encountered pirates who were Caribbean islanders, or who were Indian or Chinese or Japanese or Korean or whatever. And so in some cases, the opponents they were facing might have altered the weapons that they chose to use. We have some anecdotes later on. Apparently Japanese pirates were particularly determined, and there was a lot of advice to carry multiple pistols if you thought you were going to encounter Japanese pirates, just to shoot them as many times as possible before they came to hand-to-hand combat. So they were very highly respected. So in some cases people chose specific types of sword or specific types of weapon because of the opponents that they were likely to face in that region. And the other thing to mention as well, if I just grab here, I've got a parang nabur, which to some of you might look like a pirate sword. It's not at all. But in some cases, they may have adopted local weapons. So absolutely, we know that in some cases Europeans did adopt Japanese weapons or Chinese weapons or such like, because they were available. So if your weapons are going through wear and tear and you're adopting new ones, well, if you have a pirate operation operating near Shanghai, well, clearly Chinese swords are going to be what's available. So you might equip your men on deck with those Chinese, Qing dynasty Dao, for example. So whatever is available might just be what you use. So you don't always necessarily choose what is best or what is optimal. You sometimes just choose what is the most available thing and will do the job. So all of that being said, let's have a look at some specific pirates and some imagery of the time, and actually see if we can gain any information from that. How useful is that? Now, before we go into this, I have to obviously caveat this with the fact that these are images of pirates by people who are making, in some cases, judgments on these pirates. So this is interpretive art. It might be of the period and might tell us some useful things, but we have to be very, very careful using this as a historical piece of information, because all history has bias written into it, and art is no different. These aren't all, in some cases they are portraits, but in most cases these aren't portraits. They're actually a caricature of a person who was either hugely feared, hugely hated, hugely admired. So what weapon you show the hero or the villain with is very much supposed to portray something about their character. If they're very barbarous, if they're very cruel, if they have adopted the customs or the fashions or the weapons of another people, of another area, and all of these kinds of things. So there's a huge amount of baggage tied into interpreting historical artwork. So first up, we're going to look at a French pirate whose real name was Jean-David Nauch, and he was better known as Francois l'Olonnais, and he was around in the 1600s. He was born in about 1630. His famous piratical activity was in the 1660s, and he died in 1669. Now this image, we have to make all of the cautionary advice about interpreting this. There are some issues with this image, particularly if you look at the quillons or quillon, as the French would say, the guard, the cross guard of the sword. But it is very clearly what we would call a dussac, or some people might call it a cutlass, and I think calling it a cutto or a cutlass is not too inaccurate, but I think it would more correctly be called a dussac at this time, or a hangar in England. So there we go. In a sense, this is kind of the archetypal pirate sword, isn't it? But if you look at the hilt, it's not the bowl hilt that we see in the 19th century. It is a very typical 17th century hilt. So this image is from 1684. So it's from the sort of correct historical period. And it is associated with the pirate. And you'll notice there are some features that we're going to see repeated in other images here. It is a relatively short blade. It is a curved blade. It has a clipped point. Sometimes known as a cat's claw in Spanish, I think. It has a shell guard on one side, and it has quillons or cross guard, and a little pommel. So it's a descendant of the falchion, actually. Okay, so the falchion of the Middle Ages in one line is related to, certainly a related object to the langmesser, but also the hangar, or hengel as it was called in England in the 15th century. And this is a related, and the dussac as well, and this is a related object. So if we look at the 16th century treatises, martial arts treatises, by people like Paul de Mer, we see the dussac, and this is the same weapon. That's the practice version, but this is the real version. So there we go. We can see that in 1684, an artist who was trying to represent Francois l'Olonnais believed that he should have been equipped with one of these swords. Why did they think that? Was that because this was seen as a sword typical of pirates? Possibly. Now the next pirate to mention is Sir Henry Morgan, and I did want to find an example of Henry Morgan with a sword, and I couldn't really find a reliable one from the period. But interestingly, I did find an image of Sir Christopher Mings, who Morgan served under. Now what's interesting is the sword that he's shown with is very much a gentleman's sword. I would call it a transitional rapier, but you could possibly call it a spadroon, and it's not so far unrelated from things like the Walloon hilt as well, so it's a little bit unclear to see precisely what sword it is, but it's clearly double-edged. It's clearly a relatively narrow thrust-centric sword, and this is a gentleman's sword, but this is a gentleman's portrait, of course. So we always have to be careful that, you know, this is not him being represented as a pirate, this is him being represented as a gentleman. But we have to remember that some of the people involved in piracy were gentlemen, so if you're going to see them represented with a sword, they're going to be represented with a gentleman's sword, because it tells you about them as a person, them as an individual. Does that mean that that's the sword they would have actually carried on the high seas? Hell no. We know, certainly from later centuries, 18th, 19th century, we know that in some cases someone might have been painted wearing a small sword or their regimental officer's sword, but when they're actually on campaign, they may have used some form of sabre or a basket hilt or a local sword, a native sword like a tulwar or whatever. So who knows? But basically, this does show us, remind us that in some cases pirates didn't necessarily use a pirate sword. They sometimes just used their sword. What was their sword? Well, they walked around with a small sword or a spadroon, so that's what they used. So the next pirate to look at is Henry Every. Now, there is a woodcut of him. Now, admittedly, this is after his death, so this woodcut's from about 1725, I believe. And this shows a sword which is quite generic. The woodcut, being the nature of the art that it is relatively basic, but it appears to be a military sword, an officer's sword, well, of the type that would be carried by military officers, that seems to be a sort of half-basket spadroon, is my guess at what it is. It could be a cavalry backsword as well, but it doesn't appear to be short. It does not appear to me to be curved, or you know, a cutto or dussac type thing, or a cutlass. It does appear to be the sort of sword that would have been carried by either an infantry or a cavalry officer with a half-basket guard. So this is an interesting one because it's not showing a sword which in any way, to me anyway, seems to sort of politically or representationally show him as a pirate. He looks like a gentleman here. Now we're going to get into some pirates who probably, if any of you are interested in pirates, you will have heard about. They're the famous pirates. Some of them even represented, not very historically accurately at all, in the series Black Sails. But some of these will be famous names to you and you will have heard of them. Even if you don't necessarily know anything about the historical originals, you will almost certainly have heard these names. So this is Bartholomew Roberts. This is an image, again, I think this is it's a copper engraving, this one actually, and it's by Captain Charles Johnson from 1724. So it's of the period, it's a little bit later, but it's of the period. And again, this shows Roberts very much like a gentleman, but with one important difference I'll mention in a second. But he's holding a small sword. So here we clearly have a pirate holding a small sword. So this goes back to what I said, that if you wanted to carry any type of sword you wanted to, you could very much. Small swords were very, very popular at this period. They were very fashionable, very in vogue. And if we look at the clothes that he's wearing, he is very clearly fashion conscious to some degree, and he's showing himself as a rich, noble man, a powerful member of the gentry in a way. So he's carrying a gentlemanly sword, the small sword. Now, the one pirate concession I wanted to mention is if you look at the bandolier of pistols, this is something which turns up time and time again in 18th century period illustrations of pirates. That is, having multiple pistols suspended somehow from a form of bandolier around the neck. This appears perhaps to be tucked into the coat, but we sometimes see them stuck through loops in a sort of leather belt, cross belt. A bit like a baldric, but I suppose we could call it a bandolier. He's not purely represented as a gentleman, even though he's shown as a pirate in front of his fleet. He is shown with multiple pistols, not something that a normal gentleman would walk around with, and he's got a small sword. So pirates can have small swords. This being said, there's another bit of art that we actually get information about swords of this period from. Some information, you obviously have to interpret it and take everything into account, but that's pirate flags. And there is a flag here which Roberts flew, and he had it around 1720, and it was known as a black flag with death's head and cutlass in it. And in this, the cutlass, the aforementioned cutlass, is very clearly a single-edged curved short sword. With, you know, who knows what the actual original hilt was like. But nevertheless, so therefore we've got Roberts very much in a posed picture showing him with a small sword, but we know that he flew a flag featuring a cutlass. Why would you have a cutlass on a flag if it wasn't somehow associated with these pirates? So perhaps even if he carried a small sword because he was in charge, all of his men wouldn't have carried small swords. His men probably would have carried some form of cutto, dussac, cutlass, whatever you want to call it. Amusingly also, amongst the various flags that Roberts used, also there was one representing a flaming sword, and I'm not sure how to interpret that at all. Maybe in a Game of Thrones context, maybe he had some way of igniting a sword to put fear into the hearts of his enemies. I can't imagine you doing this with a small sword, but anyway, it's just an interesting anecdote to note that flaming swords and cutlasses and other types of sword are something that very much feature, even in the period, in the mindset and iconography associated with pirates. So another famous pirate is Calico Jack, John Rackham, his real name. And here we've got a illustration, a woodcut from Charles Johnson's 1725 edition of A General History of Pirates. Now, a lot of these images come from the same books, so we have to also caveat all of these things that we're saying with the fact that this doesn't necessarily tell us anything in some of these cases about the sword that the actual pirate would have carried, either in dress or on campaign or whatever. But nevertheless, these are period historical sources, so take them as you will, but just be careful with how you interpret them. And in this case, he's shown actually with a fairly long-bladed straight sword, seems to be probably double-edged. It's a form of, maybe it could be a backsword, but a backsword or a broadsword with a form of basket hilt. It looks to me like a half basket hilt, so perhaps something more like a walloon hilt, perhaps even a Hounslow type hilt, something like this. But he was born in 1682 and died in 1720. So, and this image is from 1725. So we're looking at the first quarter of the 18th century. And again, this shows a type of sword that wouldn't at all have been uncommon for either an infantry officer or a cavalry officer to carry, pretty much in any part of Europe or America, North America. So this isn't a pirate-specific sword, it's just a sword. It's a battle sword, it's a military sword of the period. So here we have Charles Vane, who's obviously a very main character in the series Black Sails, where incidentally they had a lot of pirates interacting who didn't interact in real life because they lived at slightly different times. But anyway, that's for another video. But here we have, again, notice the pistols in the sort of bandoliers. So we've got, or perhaps in something on the coat, but we've got that theme of multiple pistols, which is very much a pirate thing. And the sword he's holding is sort of problematic because this image is from a book called The History and Lives of All the Most Notorious Pirates. So obviously it doesn't necessarily show anything realistic, but it is of the right period, and it might show the type of sword that people had heard that pirates did carry. And again, it's not a typical pirate sword. It's not a cutlass, it's not a dussac, it's not curved, it's not short, doesn't have a clip point. This is a straight, appears to be double-edged sword. But what's problematic about the guard of this is, at first sight, it looks a bit like a Landsknecht Katzbalger. Now, it's not at this date, so we have to think, well, what actually is that? And I think it's a form of walloon hilt. I think that's what it's supposed to be. So I think what we're seeing here is a walloon-hilted broadsword with a double-edged blade. But again, this is a military-type sword. This is the sort of sword that would have been carried by an infantry officer, artillery, cavalry officer, whatever. It's not archetypally a pirate sword in itself, it's just a military sword. Next up, we have lots of people's favourite Edward Teach, Blackbeard. Obviously one of the most famous pirates ever to have lived. He was born in 1680 in Bristol, probably, and died in 1718. You'll notice a lot of these people did live around, a lot of these really famous people did live around this period, incidentally. And what's interesting about Blackbeard is he's so famous, we actually have 2 or 3 good images of the period from the early 1700s. We've got one here which is from 1736, which is quite a bit later, which doesn't necessarily tell us very much about his sword, although you can see it seems to have some sort of animal head, perhaps lion head pommel, with a cross guard. Okay, now that's interesting because it has a cross or an open guard as opposed to a form of knuckle bow or basket hilt or shell guard. There could be a shell on the outside, admittedly, but there doesn't seem to be from that image. Now, one thing we have to mention is that in this period there was another set of swords which haven't actually shown up until this point, which are commonly known as hunting swords. They could also in period be known as simply cuttos, but they were often referred to as hunting swords. Now, hunting swords were obviously used for hunting, but they were used for a lot more besides. They were also used for general travelling around, for, you know, woodcraft, travelling through the wilderness, all this kind of stuff. So the kind of general purpose, halfway between a sword and a hunting implement and a machete, kind of to fulfill all of those roles. But there were variations. Some of them are more fragile and more dress items. Some of them are very utilitarian, more like a wood chopper really, and everything in between. And this seems to be what he's wearing here. Now, we also have this other image of Blackbeard, which comes up all over the internet, actually, if you search for him. But it's actually from different editions of related books, essentially. So they're quite derivative and they have the same features. But notice, in this, we've got the old pirate archetypal stuff. We've got the bandolier or set of pistols worn on the front of the coat. And then we've got a sword, which really does look like a typical pirate sword, doesn't it? It's got a short curved blade with a clipped back point, but it's got a crossguard. Now, it's interesting that again they show a crossguard in this case rather than a more period typical hilt. But I have some reservations about this, because if you actually look at the crossguard, you'll notice that the quillons of it turn downwards towards the hand, which is not something we normally see because it doesn't really help you holding the sword very much. Usually quillons would either be straight or curve upwards towards the point, not down towards the pommel. So that makes me a little bit dubious. If we look in the other version we've got of it here, it's actually more believable. It's more like an S-guard with a knuckle bow, which is more believable of the time. And we've got the common feature of it does seem to be a form of cutlass or cutto, or hangar, or dussac. So that could fit, absolutely. And very much he looks the archetypal idea of the pirate, doesn't he? He's got, I think what most people would agree, that's a pirate sword, and he's got some pistols. Now, in the final image I'm going to take from the period, again, this is around 1725, I believe. And this is an image of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. And now this is highly, highly politicised, and it's very clear that they're trying to show certain things about these women who'd gone against every part of society of the time and become pirates. And you know, they've got the pistols tucked into the bandolier or sash, whatever you want to call it. They've also got axes, which is quite unusual, boarding axes, almost to make them seem even more barbarous. And then they've got swords. We can only really see one of the swords. I believe that's Anne Bonny's sword, clearly. And it's very much like Blackbeard's sword. It's a curved, single-edged sword with a clipped point, quite kind of, should we say, oriental influence. So what the European idea of a scimitar would be, or perhaps a Turkish sword or a North African sword, which they at the time, of course, thought of as the barbaric nation. So they're trying to paint these women as barbarous and terrifying in a way, I suppose, terrifying to their ideas anyway. And then if we look at this other image of them, they've both got their breasts hanging out of their shirts. They're just, you know, they've still got the axes in there. They've gone full on political here they're just making characters, even though this is the period that these people actually lived. So I don't think these are true attempts at all at a portrait. They're more about the idea than the reality. But that being said, this is from the period. This is showing swords sort of the period. So that very clearly at the time that these pirates were alive, there was the idea, there was the belief that these people in some cases were using these types of sword, which, let's face it, are not really common usually in Europe and North America as normal swords. They are trying already to make something piratical about their swords. And this is the root of what we now have in our, so entrenched in our media, the idea of the pirate sword, the cutlass as we now know it, but really what in the period probably would have been more often known as a dussac or a cutto or a hangar. So there we have it. I think that it's fair to say that the pirate sword was a thing, at least in the imagination of people of the time. And, you know, we shouldn't underestimate what an important thing that is. That's what's come down to us as the idea of the pirate sword. What we must detach ourselves from, though, is the idea that the typical 19th century cutlass with a bowl guard is the sort of thing that they would have been carrying in the golden age of piracy. They wouldn't, okay? The fact is that they would have been carrying swords that were typical of whichever period they were in, and whatever was available as well. So in some cases, absolutely, it would have been something not dissimilar to the idea of the pirate cutlass, but with a hilt of a design appropriate to the period. So in the late 1600s, it would have been a form of dussac or perhaps Sinclair hilted cutlass. If we get into the 18th century, it would have been more typical of types of hunting hang-up and military hang-up in those periods as well. In some cases, simple crossguards may have been preferred, and there is some suggestion in the period artwork that possibly simple cross hilts, which we do find on hunting swords, admittedly. Even George Washington's sword has a simple cross hilt on it. So possibly, maybe there's an implication that pirates liked these simple cross hilts for some reason. Maybe they got in the way less and got caught on things less. Who knows? But the other thing that we really mustn't brush aside is the fact that a lot of these pirates were probably carrying the exact same variety of swords that other people in the period were carrying, and they probably had several swords and carried them in different contexts. So if they were wanting to seem powerful and stately, they would wear their most expensive clothes and their finest hat with all the plumes, and they would carry a silver hilted small sword made with a great, hallmarks on the hilt and everything else. But if they were wanting to seem like a commander and a serious military leader, then indeed they might carry some form of basket-hilted sword, some big military sword. And some of it may have depended very much on their own background, their upbringing. Were they brought up in an upper-class, middle-class family, and they regarded themselves as a gentleman, or did they regard themselves as a soldier, more of a serious, a sort of Cromwell type, who associated more with soldiery type things, military type things, military swords, cavalry swords, things like this. But the simple fact is that pirates could carry any sword they wanted in most situations. Did they maybe have preferences? Maybe. There's an implication there that maybe what we would call cutlasses, cuttos, hangers, dussacs, maybe they were perhaps more popular, certainly for the typical sailors of these pirate vessels. When it comes to the officers and the leaders, the famous pirates that we know the names of, the Blackbeards and the Calico Jacks, I think it's a different set of things. So I think when we talk about a pirate sword, you've got to talk out who's the pirate, when is the pirate, which particular pirate are you talking about? The person who's manning the rigging or the person who's commanding the ship? So those would have been different swords as well. I hope this has been thought-provoking and useful. And I'd really appreciate your thoughts underneath on this topic, or extra information as well. If you know really cool images from the, should we say, the 1730s or earlier, showing actual pirates, I'd love to see what swords, if we can see their swords, what swords they have, or what swords the artists believed that they had. Because I think it's a really interesting topic, and I don't think many people actually have done a lot of research on it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you really soon again on the channel for another video, and take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.